on Jerusalem Dateline. This week on Jerusalem Dateline, Christians gather for a world summit in Washington, D.C. on behalf of persecuted Christians.
You have the prayers of the American people.
Plus, a look back at the miracle of the Six-Day War.
And which has achieved today what millions of Jews throughout the generations have prayed for.
And a look from high above the Dead Sea and the fortress of Masada. Hello and welcome to this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. I'm Chris Mitchell. Some say the church is facing more persecution right now than in any other time in modern history. That's why evangelist Franklin Graham put together the World Summit in defense of persecuted Christians in Washington, D.C. Paul Strand was there.
More than 200 million Christians in some 50 nations are facing high, very high, or even extreme persecution. Just about every month, more than 300 are killed for their faith.
Persecuted Christians often feel isolated and alone. Franklin Graham called this summit to let them know the church stands in solidarity with them, and it's working on solutions to fight that persecution.
The presence of the U.S. Vice President showed the attacks are getting attention at the highest levels.
How deeply humbling it is for me to stand today before the courageous men and women who are with us, who have stood without apology for their faith in Christ and suffered persecution across the wider world.
Because being captured on camera at such a summit could cause them further trouble back home, those actually facing persecution preferred telling their stories behind closed doors. But Graham warned believers here in the U.S. are also starting to face discrimination, such as homosexual attacks on Christian businesses.
We've seen businesses put out of business, targeted, and then the gay activists come in, and liberal judges in those states support these decisions. And we see businesses now afraid, Christians are afraid that they'll be attacked.
Pence assured those facing persecution and discrimination this nation won't forget them.
You have the prayers of the American people, prayers of my family, and you have the prayers of the President of the United States.
And I appreciate that President Trump has kept his word. And he's going to do that, not just on religious liberty, but I think he's going to do this in fighting ISIS and defeating the enemies of the cross.
Franklin Graham hopes that church leaders return to their homes encouraged and ready to stand faithful for the gospel, no matter what they face. Paul Strand, CBN News, Washington.
For years, CBN News has reported on the persecuted church around the world. George Thomas put together this reflection and tribute to how believers have suffered for their faith in Jesus Christ.
Today, our Christian brothers and sisters in many countries are facing persecution and martyrdom on an unprecedented scale. In fact, throughout the world, the number of Christians facing hostility, persecution, and even death is greater than any other time in history. This, not of course, is the first time Christians have faced opposition and persecution. Since the days of Saul of Tarsus and his determined effort to stamp out the name of Christ, Christians have been imprisoned and killed by tyrants and fanatics of every kind. Persecution of Christians is no longer limited to one nation or to one area of the world. Today, the Christian faith is under attack in almost every corner of the globe. Today, powerful demonic forces that are absolutely opposed to Christ and His church reach across national borders and cultures. And they see Jesus Christ and His followers as their enemy in their struggle for worldwide domain.
In addition to destroying several churches, the rioters targeted Christian schools. This particular Christian school was home to some 240 students. The majority of them were Muslim. And as they ransacked each classroom, they left behind a message on the blackboard. This one reads, "There is no God but God, and the Prophet Muhammad is his messenger."
It is true that God's word cannot be silenced. And even in the midst of the fiercest persecution, God is still sovereign, and He is still at work, often in hidden and unexpected ways. He can take our pain, He can take our suffering, and He can turn it into good.
Worthy is the Lamb, worthy is the Lamb, you are holy.
Let us never forget, therefore, that we have a responsibility to speak out for our brothers and sisters in the faith that are undergoing persecution. We must do all that we can to defend and aid those who are victims. Our churches need to hear their cry. You see, when people pray, chains fall off. When people pray, gates that were closed, gates that were locked, are opened. When people pray, people get set free. Let us never forget, therefore, that we have a responsibility to speak out for our brothers and sisters in the faith that are undergoing persecution. We must do all that we can to defend and aid those who are victims.
Up next, a look back at Israel 50 years ago on the eve of the Six-Day War.
Whoever leaves last should turn off the light and leave the country. That was the mood.
Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas says he's ready to sign a peace deal with Israel. The Jerusalem Post quotes sources close to the talks with the Trump administration, and they describe Abbas as showing unprecedented readiness to forge a deal under the auspices of President Trump. Trump will make his first official visit to the Middle East later this month. Sources told the Post Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is angry with New York businessman Ron Lauder for pushing a deal at this time. Israel has always insisted that an agreement will only come with direct negotiations between the two parties. Long before any talk of a peace process 50 years ago in the spring of 1967, it was a time of almost unbearable tension for Israel's leaders. Threats of invasion came from every direction, and Western allies turned their backs on the Jewish state. Egypt shut down the Red Sea Straits, while Syria shelled Galilee villages. But in Israel's darkest hour, a voice of calm emerged to describe the coming miracle. John Wagi explains.
By the end of May 1967, the die was cast. Israel would soon be at war on all borders. Prime Minister Levi Eshkol tried to reassure the nation, but he was ill and faltered during his address. Military General Chaim Herzog stepped in to fill the gap with radio commentary in Hebrew and English.
A new page has been opened in the history of our people's battles and of the courage of Israel. And deep in the heart of each and every one of us at this moment, when we think of those engaged in the struggle, there is, irrespective of whether we normally pray or not, a prayer that the guardian of Israel shall neither slumber nor sleep.
During the Six-Day War, Chaim Herzog didn't just calm the nation. He became Israel's first military ruler over Judea and Samaria in more than 2,000 years. He was also a powerful presence as UN ambassador and later as president of Israel. Chaim Herzog died in 1997, but his legacy lives on. His son Isaac is now chairman of Israel's leading opposition party, the Zionist Union. He was only 7 when the war broke out. Still, he remembers the prevailing fear.
What we know is that there was a period of awaiting about 3 weeks before the war, where the national mood was Auschwitz. Israel is going to its second Holocaust. Whoever leaves last should turn off the light and leave the country. That was the mood.
Isaac's older brother Michael, now a retired major general, was 15 at the time. He says there's no doubt Israelis were concerned about the nation's survival.
So I still remember ourselves, like many other people in Israel, digging trench in our backyard because we expected that we'll be shelled, and we were shelled. Tel Aviv was shelled by the Jordanians during the Six-Day War.
The young people who have abandoned the cafes of Dizengoff Street and the discotheque, the farm boys, the yeshiva students, the members of the youth movements, the boys of the immigrant townships, all are at this moment shoulder to shoulder fighting in the air, on the land, and on the sea for our right simply to live.
You know what's interesting is we hear a lot today about the term fake news and that kind of thing. 67 was a banner year for fake news, especially in Egypt and in Syria, and your father was kind of counteracting that to a people that didn't know really what was happening. They had to hear the truth.
We would hear what was called Kol Kahir, Voice of Cairo, and they would speak in Hebrew, and they would say the worst things. We're going to throw you to the sea. I guess you heard it.
They said terrible things, and there was anxiety, but he provided very professional analysis. He first of all, he knew the situation.
I am broadcasting from Jerusalem to the sound of heavy shelling. A strange form of quiet and anticipation has fallen along the front line, a quiet that may foretell great tidings.
He would broadcast 3 times a day. He would also broadcast in English, so there were both BBC and others, but the 3 times a day you would walk in the streets of Tel Aviv and you would hear his voice throughout the city, people just listening, stopping and listening. And it was awesome. I heard his voice in the trench. I heard my dad, my mom brought a little radio, and we would hear him in the trench, and he calmed us down.
I was told by soldiers then in the front lines, and they would listen to him, and I was told by quite a few of them that this really boosted their morale before going into battle.
Just one day into the war, Israel's Air Force virtually destroyed the capacity of Egypt, Syria, and Jordan to strike from the air. On the ground, Israel's army penetrated deep into the Sinai and pushed toward Jordan on the West Bank. By day 3, Chaim Herzog could tell the nation the unthinkable. After 2 millennia, Jerusalem was back in Jewish hands.
The miracle of our generation continues, as does the brilliant campaign, the like of which there is no record of in the history of Israel, and perhaps in the history of the nations, and which has achieved today what millions of Jews throughout the generations have prayed for.
We live in a very different era than 1967, but in my mind, what our father, the impact his broadcast had on the national morale is reminiscent of the impact that Churchill's broadcast had on British morale during World War II, and that was very significant.
And indeed, the saying goes, Jerusalem is a gift of the whole land of Israel. On the altar of the Temple Mount and Mount Moriah, the people of Israel offered up today priceless sacrifices which swell the toll of sacrifice by earlier generations. Our victory was not lightly achieved, and at this moment it is well that we remember those who offered up their lives for the glory of the Almighty and the nation.
Today, both Herzogs are strong supporters of a 2-state solution between Israel and the Palestinians, despite growing skepticism about the peace process among many Israelis. The hope is that 2017 can be a year of breakthrough.
There is a golden opportunity in the region whereby you just need to stretch your hand, and under American support, especially I believe from the White House, there could be a sea change in the region, Israel being recognized by all its neighbors, and we need to sit down and get to the difficult moment of trying to make peace. This is what we owe to the casualties who fell in the war, who were so brave in very difficult battles, and to the fact that we want the Jewish nation to live in peace and strength in the region whilst celebrating that great victory.
John Wagi, CBN News, Jerusalem.
Coming up, a behind-the-scenes look at the most iconic photo from the Six-Day War.
Because it sort of made my career, that one picture.
Probably the most enduring image from the 1967 Six-Day War is a picture of 3 paratroopers at the Western Wall. Photographer David Rubinger, who passed away in March, took that picture and many other moments in Israel's history. A few years ago, Rubinger told me the story behind the historic photo.
For more than 7 decades, David Rubinger chronicled the history of modern Israel. From the 1947 UN vote for partition, paving the way for the Jewish state, to many of its leaders like David Ben-Gurion and Golda Meir, Rubinger was there, camera in hand.
In retrospect, consider that I was very lucky because I happened to have a professional life which coincided with the creation of a state. 60 years, that gave me a chance that very few photographers have to really cover a story, an entire story from A to Z.
His most famous photograph came in 1967 during the battle for Jerusalem.
Tell us about the picture that has become an icon in Israeli history.
Well, that night the night before I was in Sinai. I was with the brigade that broke through at Rafiah, and I heard on the radio I had mentioned about Jerusalem. The helicopter came down to pick up some wounded. Nobody asked me, there was no tickets registered for that flight. I just squeezed in.
In the midst of the Six-Day War, Rubinger flew from the Sinai to Beersheba. He then drove to Jerusalem, stopped for a quick visit with family, and headed straight to the Western Wall.
Rubinger arrived here just minutes after the paratroopers captured the city. The wall was crowded, and in 1967, the distance between the wall and nearby homes was just about 10 feet. So to get a better perspective, Rubinger got down on the ground and began to shoot.
And I was lying on the ground and shooting, and these three soldiers just walked by. I got 3 frames, nearly identical.
Rubinger's photo not only captured the heroism of the paratroopers, but also the end of a 2,000-year-old dream of the Jewish people to return to Jerusalem. Given its fame, Rubinger didn't even think it was the best picture he took that day. He preferred this photo of Rabbi Goren riding the shoulders of the paratroopers. Even so, he chose the negative of the 3 paratroopers to give the government over the Goren photo. Then, in 1967 terms, it went viral.
The government press office started printing and handing out for 2 lira, 2 pounds, which is the equivalent of about 20 cents today, I think. And anybody could buy it, and everybody bought it. AP put it on the cover of their book. I was mad, I was hopping mad.
Years later, Rubinger changed his mind.
And I'm now grateful for all the thieves, because it made my career. That one picture.
That day at the wall also changed his life, leading to a wave of emotion.
The crying was a result of the 3 weeks that preceded this moment. You must not forget, Israel was in a mood of facing doomsday, everything. Everybody thought, maybe we'll win, but we'll cost thousands.
Instead, Rubinger said the Six-Day War was like life from the dead.
If you're about to die, or you think that your chances of survival are very, very low, and you're not only alive, but Israel is 5 times its size. You've beaten all the Arab armies. You're king of the world. The whole world admires you. You burst out crying.
Rubinger died just a few months before the 50th anniversary of his famous photo. While he often disagreed with Israel's policy after the '67 war, Rubinger felt very special about the country he followed with his camera.
I think it's unprecedented in history that people did in 60 years what this country did in 60 years. From 600,000 people or so in 1948 to 7 million, with progress on all fronts, in all fields. So with all my criticism, with all my misgivings about what's happening now, in the historic view, I think there are very, if any, precedents in history at all that can compare to it.
Up next, up, and away, over the Dead Sea and the ancient fortress of Masada when we come back. One of the most visited tourist sites in all of Israel is the ancient fortress of Masada near the Dead Sea. Here's some spectacular footage of the fortress itself and the natural wonder of the Dead Sea. That's amazing footage. It's also an example of what you can see on our social media. So please check out our Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube, and share with your family and friends. Well, that's it for this edition. Thanks for joining us. I'm Chris Mitchell. We'll see you next time on Jerusalem Dateline.